Welcome to today's video. Today we look at the story of a newly built house in which one rainy summer day the kitchen exploded. Imagine you have a family and you bought a house in a new building. You move in, you live there, you are a happy family. But one rainy summer will change when your kitchen explodes out of nowhere. At first you think it was lightning or an earthquake, but after the second explosion, when the flames are already rising, you will understand that it will not be lightning or earthquake. The story of this house, why the house exploded, and what will actually happen we will tell in today's video. If you are not subscribed to these channels, then press the subscribe button. Thank you. In the summer of 2010, the ground collapsed under the kitchen of one of the apartments in the newly built apartment building. It turned out that under the building is an old cellar full of toxic and explosive chemicals. 6 families had to move out on their own, as the state had to move them out of the house, as it was found that the house and everything else in it was heavily soaked in a dangerous poison. Families had to leave their homes and leave everything there. B, who has 3 children, was just getting ready for dinner when she suddenly heard an earthquake-like growl. The house shook and several explosions ensued. On the day of B's explosion, the sons were not at home. Only B and her youngest daughter, who remained terrified of the blast to death, were at home. After the explosion, B noticed a huge crater in the middle of the kitchen and the apartment was slowly flooded with pungent white smoke. They immediately ran out. At first, everyone thought the explosion was caused by gas, and firefighters were called to the scene, but they found something completely different, a cellar covered only with soil and several bottles and barrels in which life-threatening carcinogenic compounds, chlorophenols, were present. Dioxins, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, explosive chemicals, picric acid, heavy metal and pesticide residues, DDT, atrazine. What preceded this whole thing? The explosives factory was built in the area in the 1960s by craftsman Gyula, who was engaged in the production of explosives. He is said to have produced something for the former state-owned export company Chemolimpex. It is not known exactly what, but it is certain that the neighbors of the time repeatedly complained to the council that toxic chemicals were repeatedly poured into the soil and wells. They did not go far with the complaint until the craftsman's death in 1977 ended his activity. Gyula had no descendants, so after his death the area passed into state ownership. In 1988, the council planned to build a residential house here. In accordance with the legislation at the time, it carried out the remediation of the area, i.e. the decontamination of any heavy metals and the exchange of soil to a depth of 1 meter. The state did not build in the end. In 1994 the village sold the area to the developer, from which she demanded an expert opinion and a change of soil in a half-meter layer. It did not happen for years until finally the 6-apartment terraced house was built at the beginning of Milnia. Studies show that barrels contain, among others, picric acid, dioxin, chlorophenol and chloropesticide, the 4 most carcinogenic compounds. The barrels probably remained in the country after the craft activity, their contents spilled into the soil for decades, and it constantly evaporated from the ground as colorless, odorless poisons. It has not been proven that all this was caused by toxins hidden under the ground. Since there was a so-called cold explosion, the chain reaction with the earth. Fortunately, the gas that escaped from the damaged pipeline did not fortunately continue. If there was also a gas explosion, the house would probably disappear, even with the railway rails whose route leads immediately to the house. The barrels that caused the damage got there decades ago, during which time the complex changed owners several times, was private, then state, then municipal, and finally private again. There have been several surveys in the area, but they have not looked for substances that eventually caused the explosion, but especially for heavy metals. There should also be a change of soil, to a depth of half a meter, but it is not demonstrable that when changing the soil, especially when building the foundations of the house, they did not notice the cellar, which was already there. Some residents believed that the trucks carrying the land actually just walked around the street and then drove it back to the land. Residents and local governments tried in vain to find out what activity took place in the area because it was a state secret. It is so likely that the plant worked with military explosives and that everyone in the industrialist Julius family died of some form of cancer. It is more than strange that in the 1960s, the industrialist Gulo was able to carry out such an important activity on his own land in the interest of the national economy. For some reason, national security interests could still be jeopardized today if it became clear what materials were being produced here slowly half a century ago during the dictatorship. Bee wandered from apartment to apartment with her 3 children for a year and a half until they finally managed to buy a small apartment. The other 5 families have been rented since then, and most pay mortgages on a house they haven't lived in for more than a decade. Carcinogenic toxic fumes. There are scattered toys and children's clothes in the children's room. Subway and house demolished. The residents filed a lawsuit for damages, which they won at first instance. The municipality, on the other hand, appealed and the law changed. The powers of the city building office were taken over by government offices. However, governments are not responsible for compensation cases. Residents have legitimately reached a dead end, and local governments cannot take their compensation to account. According to the court, developer did not err, nor the Office of the Environment, and the case is already out of date. Millions of litigation costs will have to be paid by residents. The victims have turned to the Constitutional Court, but are willing to go as far as Strasbourg. Thanks for watching. If you are not yet subscribed to my channel, then press the subscribe button. See you at another interesting place.